Okay, so let's look at the more complex conditional formats. In all the formats up to now that we've looked at, we formatted a cell based on the value in that cell. So we formatted this with green because it has a 2 in it. Or we formatted this cell with yellow because it's in 2011 and we didn't touch this cell. So we formatted each cell based only on the value inside that cell. But suppose we want to format one cell based on the value in another cell. Well, that's a real common thing. But to do it, we cannot use these built-in highlighting cells here for these ones that we looked at earlier, the highlighting, the top-bottom rules, and that kind of. We can't use those when we're going to format one cell based on another. So, for example, suppose we want to set a red fill on the work group name if the actual hours exceeds the estimated hours by more than 110%. This is a real-life example from one of the projects I worked on in a client. The managers that were in charge of plant maintenance were very much interested in the work orders where they estimated it would be some number, and it turned out to be much more than that. So, for example, this work order right here. They estimated at 19 hours. It turned out it took 31 hours. Well, there's something wrong when that happens. Either their estimate was way low, or it took the worker much more time to fix it than it should have. And typically, actually, in practice, with these kinds of work orders where the actual hours went way long, the underlying reason was the worker opened up the machine to fix a belt or something like that and found that there was another part that was leaking oil. So they opened up the machine and got surprised by another problem that no one expected to find. Well, that's usually, to them, that was a sign they weren't inspecting the machine well whenever they got surprised by finding some kind of problem in the machine. So what we'd like to do is format the cells here in the work group based on comparing these two cells out here. So we will turn this one red because the actual hours is more than 1.5 times the estimated hours. But in here the actual hours went less than 31 hours, so we'll leave that cell alone. In order to format one cell based on the values in some other cells, you have to use a formula. So let's always select the cells that we want to format to begin with. And then in conditional formatting up here, instead of choosing one of these sets, we select New Rule. Up pops this thing, and we want to use a formula to determine which cells to format. So now we're going to write an expression here that's a logical expression. It returns a true or a false. We want it to return true when the cell format will get changed. So we want to format the work groups in red if the actual exceeds the estimated. So when so we're going to say if the actual hours, that's here, F2, I'm using the first row, and it will propagate down. If F2 is greater than the estimated hours times 1.5. Now, there's something you got to watch out for here. It made these absolute references here, and we don't want that. We only want relative references here. In particular, we want the row to go relative. I'm clicking in here because if you use your left and right mouse key or keyboard keys to move around, it will not do what you want. It will start putting in strange expressions. So we're asking if F2 is greater than E2 times 1.5, then we want to turn the background red, the fill. So I've created my rule and nothing happened because I didn't set a format. There was no format set. So I'm going to go back in and edit the rule, and now I'll choose my format. I neglected to do this. So I'll come in and set the fill to red. Click on OK, click on OK. And now I have red cells here wherever the estimate was greater than the actual was greater than the estimate times 1.5. So this one went way over, that one went way over, this one went way over. When I created the formula, the reason I did it by selecting just the first two rows, let's go back and manage and edit, the reason I just used F2 and E2 is because as we move down here, it turns out relative. So this one looks at E4 and F4, and this one looks at E7 and F7 and so on. So that allows us to format these cells over here based on values in comparing these two cells using a formula. The next kind of conditional format that requires a formula is to put a light gray background on the entire row of any row of the West work group. So we're going to put a light gray on any cell that's in West. So for example, this cell, this row will go light gray, this one will go light gray, and so on. Now this one is slightly trickier. What cells are we going to format? Well, we're going to format every cell in the whole table. So to start out, I select the cells I want to format. It's the entire table like that. So I'm selecting everything. Now I come up to conditional formatting, new rule, use a formula to determine the cell format. Now, I want to look in A2 to see if it's equal to East. Or was it West in the problem? Let's go back and look at this. West. Okay, if it's equal to West. If I click on this much, and we want to send a background fill of gray, like this one here, under fill, click on OK. Now I'll click on OK, and it won't work quite right. This turned out only the name of the work group turned gray, but I wanted the entire row to turn gray. So what went wrong? Well, let's go back and look at the formula. To go back and edit it, I reselect the range of cells that I want it to apply to, come back in, select Manage Rules, and then Edit, and here's our formula. Now, the problem is when we looked at A2, we compared it to West, and it wasn't, so we left the cell alone. Then we looked at B2 and compared WTP water supply leaking to West, and it wasn't. In other words, because this is a relative expression, as we moved across every cell in the table, it compared the cell only to its own contents. And that means, for example, if I came into this cell here, just this one for example, I'll type the word West in here and watch, it'll go gray. Because that relative function, the A2, the relative cell reference of A2, was being updated to point to the current cell. So what I want to do is modify this reference right here, the A2, so that I can freeze column A and allow the 2 to go up and down as it goes down the column. So I'm going to make the A absolute and allow the 2 to float, be relative, and that will be a nice mixed expression. I click on OK, and OK again, and now it's formatted the entire row because this cell is looking at A6, and this cell is looking at A6, and that cell is looking at A6, and so on. So that works just the way we'd like it to. Remember, you select the entire range that you're formatting and then go in and put your formula in. All right, finally we get to this last example of formatting one cell based on the values in some other cells. We're going to make the font of the actual hours title at the top of the column red if the total of the actual hours exceeds 400. Well, let's go look in the actual hours column. Here it is. And if I select all the cells in that column, you can see that the sum is 461, so it should turn red. So I'm going to come in here and select just F1, the actual hours title, because that's the cell that I want to format. Now, conditional formatting, new rule, and use a formula. So what am I going to write in here? Well, I want to know if the total of this column is greater than 400. So I'm going to write a sum function, sum F2 colon F15. Now, that's going to return some number that is the sum of all those cells. I need to turn this into a logical expression to ask it in the form of a yes-no question. So I'm going to say if the sum of those cells is greater than 400, then I want to format it with, I think it was, let's see, what did we want to do? We want to use red font. So let's come over here to font and select red. Click on OK. Now, it doesn't matter here in the F2 to F15 in the midst of this thing whether I use absolute or relative because I'm just selecting the entire range and it's not going to apply to a bunch of different cells. It's only going to apply to F1. So I don't have to, it doesn't matter if they're absolute or relative or mixed here. Click on OK, and it turns red, because the sum of all these cells is more than 400, is 461. Now, just to test it, I'm going to take away some numbers here and see if I can drive the total back under 400. And when I do, then the font should go back to whatever it was before. Let's just delete the contents of a couple cells. And there. Now I drove it under 400. The sum of the column is now 354, and it went red. When I start putting cells back to get above 400 again, then it will go red. So that's how you create a conditional format that formats one cell, some cell, based on the values in other cells.